The first frost of the season had come to Laurel Fork, Virginia overnight, and the morning light was doing what it does on cold October days in the Blue Ridge, arriving thin and white across the fields as though it wasn't sure it was welcome. Sergeant James Calloway had stopped at the Pruitt place on Orchard Road, out of habit, the way he'd started stopping there every week or so since the summer, just to drop off whatever Mrs. Pruitt had asked him to pick up from the hardware store or the post office or wherever she needed. In the passenger seat, Nell lifted her head, ears forward, and made a sound James had only heard her make once before, a low, urgent thing that was not a growl and not a whine, but something between them, something that did not have a name but had a meaning. On the porch of the white farmhouse, partially hidden by the corner post, was Edna Pruitt, 83 years old, sitting in a lawn chair in the frost, in a house dress with no coat on, and she was not looking at the road. She was looking at her own hands in her lap, and she was talking, very quietly, to no one what James Calloway would learn before that Friday, about what had been happening inside that farmhouse for 7 months, about what Edna had signed without knowing, and about a promise made in Korea 70 years ago that her son was racing to a race, would not stay between just the two of them for long. If you're new to this channel, this is the kind of story we tell here. Subscribe before you go any further. You'll want to be here for what follows. James had come home to Laurel Fork from Fort Bragg 14 months ago with an honorable discharge, a mild TBI the VA had documented and mostly addressed, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over men who have been in loud places for a long time and are not yet sure what to do with the silence. He'd grown up here, in the valley between the ridges, the youngest of 3 boys in a family that had farmed and then stopped farming and then found other ways to stay. He didn't have a plan beyond not leaving. He drove for a small contracting firm 3 days a week and spent the other days doing the kinds of things that needed doing in a valley where people were spread thin and getting older. Picking up prescriptions, hauling things in his truck, fixing what he could fix. He hadn't set out to become the person people called. He just answered the phone enough times that the calls kept coming. Nell had come with him from Bragg, not officially, technically, but in the way that the most important arrangements in life are technically unofficial. She had been partnered with a corporal in James's unit who did not come home, and there had been a period of bureaucratic uncertainty about what happened to her. And James had navigated that uncertainty with a patience and stubbornness that everyone who knew him recognized as his most useful quality. She was black and lean, with eyes the color of good river water and one slightly cropped ear from something that predated her service record. She weighed 63 pounds and took up approximately half of James's interior life. When he slept poorly, which was often in the early months, she would shift from the foot of the bed to his side without waking him, and he would wake to find her pressed along his back, warm and completely still, and the night would feel more manageable than it had seemed before. He had not told anyone about this. He didn't need to. Edna Pruitt had been his 4th grade teacher. That was the whole beginning of it. Not a dramatic origin, just a woman in her late 70s who had once taught him long division and who had started appearing at the edge of his peripheral awareness after he came back, the way things that matter have a way of surfacing when you slow down enough to notice them. He had seen her at the post office in June, carrying a box that was too heavy for her, and he had carried it to her car without asking permission, and she had thanked him in the precise and undiminished voice of a woman who had managed 32 children at a time for 40 years. He had started stopping by after that. Her husband Earl had died 3 winters ago. She had loved him in the specific way of people who have been married for 53 years. Not without difficulty, not without the accumulated weight of half a century in the same house with the same person, but with a rootedness that ran deeper than preference or feeling, something more like geological fact. Earl had been a quiet man, a farmer first and a veteran second, only in the sense that farming was what he'd returned to, though the war had never left him entirely. He had served in Korea, in places he referred to only by compass direction and weather, and he had come home and planted things in the ground and raised his children, and not talked about it much. There was a plaque on the memorial wall at Laurel Fork Baptist with his name on it, and Edna touched it every Sunday after services with 2 fingers. The way you touch something you are grateful is still there. She had 2 children, a daughter, Patricia, in Roanoke, who called on Sundays and came at Christmas and was present in the specific and limited way of adult children who have their own lives and are doing their best, and a son, Gerald, who had moved back to Laurel Fork in March, Gerald was 54. He had worked in real estate in Charlotte for 15 years and had come back, he said, because he was worried about his mother living alone and because Laurel Fork was a good place to start a new chapter. He drove a newer truck. He had opinions about the house. In March, he had assessed the farmhouse with the particular attention of a man who is calculating something, and Edna had felt something she could not name in the way he looked at the kitchen and the back fields, and she had told herself she was being uncharitable, that he was her son, and he was here, and that was a good thing. By April, he was managing her accounts. By May, her car, the 2013 Camry she had driven without incident for 6 years, had been sold. Gerald explaining that the upkeep costs were too high for a vehicle she rarely needed anymore, now that he was here. By June, her mail had begun arriving opened. By July, she had noticed that the balance she checked at the ATM in town did not match what she believed should be there, and she had said something to Gerald, and Gerald had explained that he had moved funds into a new account for tax purposes and not to worry about it. She had stopped checking after that, not because she believed him, because she was afraid of what she would find if she kept looking. She still set a place at the table for Earl every morning, not out of forgetting. She knew exactly where she was and what year it was, and that Earl was gone. She said it because the habit of 53 years deserved more respect than grief, and because on certain mornings, with the Blue Ridge light coming through the kitchen window at exactly the angle it had always come, she could close her eyes and almost hear him in the chair across from her, drinking his coffee, not saying much, being there the way he had always been there. She did not tell anyone she did this. It was hers. James parked the truck on the gravel and got out. Nell was already on the ground before he came around the hood. She had pushed the passenger door open herself, something she did only when she had decided something, and she was already moving toward the porch in that quiet, deliberate way she had, not running, just going. She reached Edna before James did. She went up the porch steps without hesitating and sat down directly in front of the lawn chair, close enough that Edna could have reached out and touched her without lifting her arm. She didn't nudge or nose or perform. She simply arrived and sat and looked up at Edna with the watercolored eyes and waited. Edna looked at the dog for a long moment. Then she started talking. James was still on the bottom porch step. He didn't move. He'd learned, over 14 months back in Laurel Fork, that Nell had a gift for opening doors and people that his presence alone would close. And he had learned to give her room. He took the savings first, Edna said. She wasn't talking to James. She was talking to Nell the way people talk to dogs, directly, without performance, because a dog won't use what you say against you and won't look at you differently after. I had 41 years of savings. Earl and I both. We didn't spend extravagantly. We weren't that kind of people. She looked at Nell's eyes. Gerald said it was for the taxes. Then he said it was an investment account. Then he stopped explaining. She paused. I didn't want to call Patricia and worry her, and I didn't want to be a woman who accused her own son. She said the last sentence the way you say something you have been arguing with inside your own head for months. So I didn't say anything. I stopped looking. James sat down on the step. He watched Nell, who had not moved. He took the savings, Edna said again more quietly, and then he took the car. And now there's something with the house. He has papers. He keeps saying I need to sign them, and I keep saying I need to read them first. And he keeps saying they're just standard documents. There's nothing to worry about. She looked out at the frost on the front field. I signed something last Tuesday. I don't know what it was. She still hadn't looked at him. She was talking to the dog, but she was saying it out loud for the first time to another living thing in the world, and the saying of it was changing something in her face, not releasing it, not breaking her, but clarifying it the way cold air clarifies the outline of things. He noticed her right hand then. She had folded both hands in her lap, and the right one was on top and along the back of it, from the base of the thumb to the first knuckle. There was a burn, 3 weeks old at least, healed to a ridge of skin that was still pink and raised. Not the diffuse scald of a stove accident. A contact burn. Narrow. Specific. Nell pressed the top of her head gently against Edna's knee. Edna put her hand on the dog's head. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and James understood this about her in the way that people who have learned to carry things understand it in others. She sat with her hand on the dog's head and looked at the frost and breathed. "Mrs. Pruitt," James said. She looked at him for the first time. Something in her face had already made its decision. "When is he expecting you to sign next?" James asked. She was quiet for a moment. "He has an appointment," she said. "At the title company. He hasn't told me when, but I found it written on a notepad in the kitchen. Friday, 10 o'clock. He had 2 days. Have you ever watched someone you care about living quietly through something enormous? Something they wouldn't name, because naming it would make it real. Or because the person doing the harm was supposed to be family? If that person is still in your life, call them. Today, after this. If they're not, leave their name below. They deserve to be said out loud." James called Frank Delacroix that evening. Frank was 67, retired, had spent 22 years as a magistrate in Allegheny County before moving back to Laurel Fork to be closer to his sister. He lived 4 houses down from James on the same road, and he had a way of listening to a situation and immediately identifying the 3 most important facts in it, a quality James had come to rely on. He told Frank everything Edna had said on the porch. Frank was quiet for a moment and then said, "How many documents has she signed?" James said he didn't know. Frank said, "That's what we need to find out first." Then he said he knew someone at the County Register of Deeds and he would make a call in the morning. James also called Pastor Melinda Webb at Laurel Fork Baptist. He knew Pastor Melinda from the way you know someone in a small valley, not closely, but accurately. She had done Earl Pruitt's funeral service and had visited Edna every month since, and knew the shape of things in that household the way a pastor knows the shape of things in households she tends. When James described what Edna had said on the porch, there was a pause on the line, and Pastor Melinda said, "I noticed something changed in February. She stopped sitting in her pew. She started sitting in the back. I told myself it was the cold." Another pause. "I'll be wherever you need me Friday." Thursday morning, James went back to the farmhouse. Gerald was there. He came to the door when James knocked, a big man heavy through the shoulders, with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been told no by anyone who mattered. He looked at James, and then at Nell, and then back at James with the expression of a man recalculating. "She's got visitors handled," Gerald said. "I brought her groceries," James said, which was true. He brought them deliberately. Gerald stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he stepped aside. Edna was at the kitchen table. She looked up when James came in, and something passed across her face. Not relief, not yet, but the recognition that something was in motion that had not been in motion before. Nell went to her immediately. Gerald stood by the counter and watched. James set the groceries on the table. He looked at Gerald. "You grew up here?" he asked. Conversational. Nothing in his voice. "Born and raised," Gerald said. "Your father was in Korea?" A slight pause. "That's right. There was a man," James said, "named Holt. Robert Holt. His family's been trying to reach your mother for about 18 months. He watched Gerald's face. "You know the name?" Gerald's expression didn't move, but his hand resting on the counter pressed flat. "I don't know any Holt," he said. James nodded slowly. He'd gotten what he needed. He helped Edna put the groceries away, and then he left. Frank called that evening. The county register had a deed of trust on the property, filed in 1987 in Earl Pruitt's name, that contained a right of first refusal clause, meaning if the property was ever to be sold or transferred, a named party had to be offered the first opportunity to acquire it. The named party was Robert D. Holt. The clause had a 75-year term. It had 24 years remaining. Frank said if Gerald transfers that property before Holt's family is notified, he's not just taking his mother's house, he's breaking a legal covenant his father made. James said, "Gerald told me he doesn't know the name." Frank said, "He knows the name. They found Robert Holt's daughter, a woman named Carol, in Staunton through the County Veterans Records Office on Thursday afternoon. She picked up on the second ring." When James explained who he was and why he was calling, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "My father talked about Earl Pruitt until the day he died. They kept each other alive in the Chosine Reservoir for 11 days. She stopped. "We've been trying to reach Mrs. Pruitt for a year and a half. The number we had kept going to voicemail." James looked at the number she read to him. It was Gerald's cell phone. Friday morning came in gray and close. The kind of sky that feels like a ceiling pushed low. James was at the farmhouse at 8. Frank arrived at 8:15 with a folder of documents from the county register. Pastor Melinda arrived at 8:30 with two other women from the church. Margaret, who was 80, who had known Edna for 60 years, and Louise, who had been Earl's neighbor growing up, and who sat down next to Edna at the kitchen table and took her hand and held it without speaking. Edna looked at the people in her kitchen. She looked at James. "He'll be angry," she said. "That's all we need." At 9:40, Gerald Pruitt's truck pulled into the gravel drive. He came through the front door the way he always came through it, without knocking, moving with the forward momentum of someone who has not been stopped in long enough to expect it. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the room. James, Frank, Pastor Melinda, Margaret, Louise, Nell, who had positioned herself between the doorway and the kitchen table the moment she heard the truck on the gravel, and who was now standing very still in the center of that space, with her head lowered and a continuous sound coming from her chest that was not loud and did not need to be. Gerald looked at the dog. Nell did not move. "Mom," Gerald said. He tried to find the register of normalcy of the man in his own family's kitchen on an ordinary Friday. He almost reached it. "We've got to get going. The appointment's at 10. Edna looked at him. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Louise's hand over hers, and she looked at her son with the full and level gaze of a woman who had taught fourth grade for 40 years and had learned long ago that the only thing a child cannot endure is being seen clearly and met with the truth. She said, "I signed something last Tuesday. I don't know what it was." The kitchen was completely still. Gerald looked at the table. He looked at Frank's folder of documents. He looked at Pastor Melinda's face. He looked at James, who was standing to the left of the doorway with his hands loose at his sides, and his voice, when he spoke, so quiet and so even that it cost Gerald something just to hear it. "The deed of trust filed in 1987, James said. "Earl's right of first refusal covenant with Robert Holt. The title company on South Jefferson is going to find it the moment they run the title search, which they will do before any transfer is signed. Frank, who spent 22 years as a magistrate, can tell you exactly what that covenant means for what you've scheduled this morning." He paused. "And Carol Holt, Robert's daughter, has agreed to come to Laurel Fork next week because she has not yet had the chance to meet your mother, and she has some things she'd like to say to her about what her father said about Earl, and about 11 days in the Chosin Reservoir, and about what the two of them promised each other when they thought they weren't going to make it home." Gerald had not moved from the doorway. "There's also the matter of the savings accounts," James continued. "Frank has the routing records. And there's the matter of your mother's right hand." Gerald looked at Edna's hand. Edna did not hide it. Nell took one step forward. Gerald looked at the dog. The dog was looking back at him with the river water eyes, and the sound from her chest had not changed. Steady, continuous, the sound of an assessment already made and a patience that would not run out. When Gerald shifted his weight toward the doorway, Nell moved with him, not blocking him, just present, just tracking. She did not stop watching him until his truck was off the gravel and onto the road. And then she turned and walked back to Edna's chair and sat down, and the sound from her chest stopped, and the kitchen breathed. The title company appointment was not kept. The document Edna had signed on the Tuesday before, a limited power of attorney for property transactions, was challenged through a petition filed by Frank's attorney, Contact in Covington, on Friday afternoon, citing undue influence in the outstanding deed of trust covenant, and the petition held. Gerald did not return to the farmhouse. He did not return to Laurel Fork. The savings accounts were subject to an accounting that the same attorney described conservatively as actionable. Patricia came from Roanoke that Saturday and stayed for 3 weeks. She and Edna sat at the kitchen table in the mornings and talked in the way they had not talked in years, not because there was nothing to say, but because the days had always been too busy and the phone too flat a thing for the conversations that mattered. By the second week, Patricia had transferred her work to remote and stopped mentioning when she was leaving. Carol Holt drove up from Staunton the following Wednesday, a small woman in her 60s, with her father's eyes and an envelope she had carried for 18 months waiting for the right moment to deliver. Inside was a letter Robert Holt had written to Earl Pruitt 10 years before Earl died, A letter that had apparently been returned to sender by mistake and had sat in Carol's papers ever since. She gave it to Edna at the kitchen table while James and Nell sat on the back porch and didn't try to hear what was being said. He could see through the window from where he sat that Edna held the letter in both hands and did not open it for a long time, and when she did, she read it slowly. And when she finished, she folded it and held it against her chest with both hands for a while. And her face had something in it that was not grief and was not joy, but was the particular expression of a person who has been handed back something they did not know they had lost. There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like arrangement. When James Calloway drove down Orchard Road on that October morning, he was going nowhere in particular. He was delivering nothing more consequential than a box of seed catalogs from the post office and a new blade for the garden shears. He had no reason to stop except that Nell stood up in the passenger seat and made a sound he had learned to trust. He trusted it. What Earl Pruitt had known, somewhere in the knowledge that 53 years of marriage gives a person about another person, was that Edna would not ask for help, even when she needed it most, because she still remembered who she had been, and that person had never needed to ask. What James Calloway understood, from a kind of knowing he had brought back from places he didn't talk about, was that the people who never ask are the people who most need someone to notice. He had simply been paying attention. And Nell had noticed first. This story is for every person who is living quietly through something no one has asked about yet, and for every woman or man like Edna Pruitt who carried a weight alone because they were too proud and too dignified and too deeply themselves to put it down in front of anyone. Until a dog sat down in front of them and waited. Is there an Edna in your life? A mother? A grandmother? A neighbor you haven't checked on in longer than you meant to? Leave their name in the comments. This section should be full of people who deserve to be said out loud. I read every one. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away, and about the ones who make that choice, even when it costs them something. If that means something to you, subscribe. There are more stories to tell, and you'll want to be here for them. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.